apocalypse wasn't much of a surprise. I mean, from what I hear, the ancients kind of had it coming. When the MX-1s came and spread the fallout out, most things were toast. But after that is when things got really weird. By the time the second apocalypse came around, we were totally like, seriously? At least, that's what the Elder tells us. The Menders meant well, but something went wrong with all those machines. Like, really wrong. They just, poof, disappeared and left things worse than before they started. And I guess that just leaves us, the survivors. We live in the now because we don't know if there will be a tomorrow. At least we have each other.
Hello everybody and welcome to this video in which I am doing two things at once and multitasking, which I think is pretty damn impressive of me. I'm going to be looking at a new video game, and I am also having a look at a headset and microphone combination which was sent to me to test as well. So if my voice sounds a little bit different, that is because you are hearing it through the Pro 480 stereo gaming headset from 4Gamers, which again was sent to me to test out. So I hope I sound clear enough in this video. I hope it is still understandable. And other than that, I'm also having a look at RAD. RAD is a new video game that comes to us from Double Fine and Bandai Namco, and it is, well, it's quite delightful really. It's a bit of a surprise. I didn't know much about this game going into it. In fact, I knew absolutely nothing about it. I had not been following its development on any level, but it landed in my inbox, so I figured I'd better give it a go, and I was actually really impressed. I think this game is it's a lot of fun. It is a really delightful little video game. So RAD is basically a checklist of things what I do like. It is a homage to the 80s, and particularly the 80s early morning cartoons and weekend cartoons and the kinds of things that I remember getting up to watch early in the morning before I headed off to school, or when I was up early on a Saturday or Sunday morning. This game really does, it doesn't hide its inspiration by any means. It wears its 80s aesthetic on its sleeve. The soundtrack is direct out of the 80s as well, and the gameplay is modern, but it is also a kind of nostalgic modern type of game because it is a roguelike dungeon crawler kind of thing. So each time you get into the game, you've got randomized levels. When your character finally dies, you get returned to the start at level 0 and all that kind of stuff. It's been around, this kind of formula for video games, for a long time, so it's another type of nostalgia, I guess. I remember playing games like this back when I was a kid, so when I finished watching the cartoons, if I didn't have school to get onto, I would play something like this. So it controls like a modern game. It's not stuck in the past, I guess, like some other retro-inspired titles can be, and it definitely wears its kind of Double Fine heritage on its sleeve as well. It's got that impeccable sense of presentation and creative energy going for it as well. So it's a modern game, but it is one that is very much reliant, I guess, on your ability to understand where the 80s references are coming from and enjoy them for that, because the 80s has been, well, it was a while ago now, obviously, almost 3 decades, and in that time aesthetics have changed a lot, people's tastes have changed a lot, so that aesthetic of the 80s and the soundtrack with the synths and all that kind of stuff, that has kind of gone the same way that black and white movies have, in a way. It's an acquired taste now for people who don't mind that kind of thing, but in terms of mainstream appeal, I'm not sure that this game has it, and I'm not sure that this game will necessarily appeal to a broad audience, because again, it does really require you to be familiar with the 80s and enjoy it for that. Interestingly, for a game that's so heavily reliant on its retro credentials, this one doesn't feel too difficult. It's not the most challenging game out there, and you certainly get plenty of special abilities that come at you at a very fast rate, so there's not much of a grind to it either. You're always playing around with new attacks, new toys, you're always coming up against new enemies, and while you're seeing me deal with a boss here, this is actually the first boss I came across. It's I never really felt like I was under threat. I felt like I just had to keep moving around and doing what I do with pretty much every other action game out there, and I'd be able to deal with it. So while I did get to a point where I would die quite often, and the game isn't a cakewalk, it's also interestingly not as difficult as I think people who grew up playing games in the 80s might want. So it's almost like the developers have dropped the ball there a little bit. I don't think it's much, and I don't think people who grew up playing games in the 80s will necessarily care because they're too busy enjoying the aesthetic and all that kind of stuff. But it's certainly noteworthy that it's not as difficult as other games from that era may be. And why they did that, I'm not sure. I don't think it's going to make the game any more appealing to people who didn't grow up with these kinds of things. But it is what it is, I guess. It's a casual roguelike, let's put it that way. It's not necessarily easy, but it's also not... It's not there to really test you and make you feel like you're hardcore if you can beat it. As a roguelike, the narrative is more part of the setting than something integral to the gameplay, I guess, is probably the best way to put it. There's a setup where you're introduced to a bunch of kids and they have to go into this kind of apocalyptic wasteland to deal with various enemies and move from one level to another. And as they do that, their genes mutate and they acquire new abilities and all that kind of stuff. All of that's explained in the introduction, but it doesn't really go further than that. Once you get going into the game, it is much more about the moment-to-moment gameplay and making your way through levels and just seeing how far you can go before you finally run into a challenge that pushes you a bit too far. But it's an intriguing premise. I mean, back in the 80s there was a lot of that kind of power fantasy for teenagers stuff, whether it's He-Man or She-Ra or I'm going to really show my age here, Dungeons and Dragons, the cartoon, all of that kind of stuff. There was that common thread that you would be playing as a bunch of kids that were drawn into this fantasy world, and you needed to overcome various challenges, and it was always there because the dominant audience was the children, the kids that were watching the stuff, so it was always there to really put them into the experience. And this game is a callback to that in the way that it's structured as well. So it doesn't have a huge narrative, but it didn't really need it either. It's not about the storytelling, it's more about just, again, reminding you of what the 80s were and these kinds of games. So it's more narrative by association with what you remember from your childhood. I think the thing that I like most about this game, though, is actually the commentary. There's a voiceover that pops in at various points, and there's a good example of it there. And the voiceover guy is hilarious. He has that really overwrought, overacted, really bad voice acting vibe, which of course was how a lot of these cartoons in the 80s worked. And he comes up with some great quips. And every time that he popped up to say something, I think that was probably the strongest reminder for me about what this game's source of inspiration was. So the action feels very modern, and the presentation values, though they're a homage to the 80s, are still very modern. Again, this is a good-looking game that shows that would not have been possible back on the Super Nintendo, for example. But that voiceover is vintage 80s, and it's deliberately so, and it's really good at doing that. I guess the best comparison you can make between another game and this one is that classic Ace Team Deadly Tower of Monsters title, which was a homage to the 80s sci-fi horror genres and monster horror genres. And this game does a better job than that at being a homage. I think that game was certainly good fun in its own right, but this one has a real purity to it. You can tell that the people that made this game really grew up over watching cartoons from the 80s, and this was their childhood, and they've gone and done everything they can to put that childhood into a single game. So I'm really impressed by this one. I think it's great value. I think you do have to be a child of the 80s to get your value out of it. I don't think this will necessarily resonate with younger people, and that's okay. It's okay to have games that don't appeal to every single person on the planet. And I appreciated that this game didn't compromise on that vision to try and be all things to all people. So yeah, give it a go. I've got a full review that will go up on digitallydownloaded.net as well today. But yes, I do recommend giving it a go. And I hope the sound from this microphone has come through and I haven't just wasted the 10 minutes it's taken me to record this. Other than that, I have one other little bit of announcement to go with the digitally-downloaded.net side of what I do. We've actually released our first visual novel as of last weekend. It's a very short one. It's an introduction more than a full thing in itself, but it's very exciting and I'm quite keen to get as many people to check it out as possible. So go and find the details for that on digitally-downloaded.net as well. Otherwise, I think I'm done here. There's not much else to say. It's a good game and I enjoyed it a lot, and yeah, it's for roguelike and 80s fans. Thanks very much for watching and we will see you at the next video.
You are not RAD.